This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. It began on a golden evening in the heart of the city, where chandeliers glistened like stars trapped in glass and laughter floated through the air like perfume. I was seated alone at a corner table, notebook in hand, the aroma of truffle butter and rosemary filling my senses. To everyone else, I was just another diner, but beneath my calm smile hid a secret. I wasn't there to enjoy the food. I was there to judge it. As a Michelin food critic, anonymity was my armor. No one, not even the restaurant's most charming host, knew my name. And that's when he appeared. Lucas, the man who once promised me forever and left me shattered. His laughter reached me. Before his eyes did, that same arrogant, intoxicating laugh that used to make me melt. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his arm draped around a woman who sparkled with youth and confidence, the same kind I used to have before he crushed it under his betrayal. My heart stuttered, then hardened. I'd moved on, or at least that's what I told myself. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done playing games. Lucas noticed me. His smirk widened, that cruel, knowing curve that had once made me believe I wasn't enough. He whispered something to his new companion, who laughed as if she'd been rehearsing it all her life. And then, like a scene torn from a nightmare, he walked over to my table. "Well, if it isn't Amelia," he drawled, pretending surprise. His words dripped with mockery, his tone slicing through my calm like a blade through silk. "Didn't expect to see you here, alone as usual." I looked up, steadying my voice. "Lucas, I didn't expect to see you anywhere worth being." He laughed, but there was venom behind his charm. He reached for my glass, lifted it, and before I could react, he tilted it. Cold wine cascading over my dress, my notes, my dignity. The room fell silent, forks frozen midair. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Guess I hit a nerve." His girlfriend giggled, and I watched the staff hesitate, unsure whether to intervene. My face burned, but my eyes stayed on him. "You've made your point," I said quietly. "Oh, Amelia," he replied, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You never could take a joke." He left me there, drenched and humiliated, the sound of their laughter echoing as they returned to their table. For a moment I sat still, every breath trembling with suppressed rage. Then, slowly, I picked up my pen, smoothed out my soaked notes, and began to write. Each word carried weight. Each sentence, purpose. Because what Lucas didn't know was that I wasn't just reviewing the food. I was reviewing the soul of the establishment he managed, the restaurant he'd bragged about for months. The one depending on this very review to earn its Michelin star. My tears dried with my resolve. This wasn't just a review anymore. It was justice, plated and served cold. The waiter approached, apologizing profusely, but I simply smiled. "It's all right," I said softly. "I'll make sure everyone knows how this place treats its guests." That night, I returned home with the echo of his cruelty replaying in my mind, every detail etched into my memory, his smirk, her laugh, the hush of the restaurant as wine stained my skin. I replayed it until the pain turned into something sharper. Not sorrow, not humiliation, but power. He had wanted to make me feel small again, to remind me of who I was before I found my strength. But what he didn't realize was that I had spent years building myself into someone who could destroy him with a single signature. As I sat at my desk under the dim light, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting the fierce determination in my eyes, I whispered to the silence, "You wanted attention, Lucas. You're about to get it." And with that, I began to write the most devastating review of my career, one that would do more than just strip a restaurant of its stars. It would strip a man of his arrogance, his empire, and his pride. Because this wasn't about food anymore. It was about revenge, served with precision, and the world was about to taste it. I sat with the ruined dress folded like a raw wound on the back of my chair and let the city hum around me while I planned every deliciously precise cut. Revenge, I decided, would not be a tantrum, but a surgical operation performed in plain sight. I called no friends that night. Friends soften edges. I called sources, former chefs I'd nurtured and broken restaurants I'd exonerated, and then watched crumble, the way a sculptor studies marble to know where to strike. I dug into invoices and whispered into exhausted ears until the soft secrets spilled. Suppliers paid late, lines of unpaid overtime, a Sue who had been silenced with threats when she tried to speak up. Lucas had always loved the story he told about himself. Visionary restaurateur, lover of terroir, a man who elevated palates and people. Behind that story, I found a ledger that smelled of grease and fear, of favors pulled and corners cut. I found a manager who bullied staff into silence, who traded integrity for appearances, and a man who used women like props for his table photos. Each detail fed the hot furnace of the betrayal I carried. Memories came like knives, and I let them burn for a moment. The months he spent crafting excuses while I held his promises like a prayer, the nights I learned to live on little sleep and big ambition while he taught himself how to appear more charming to newer audiences. Then, I folded those memories into strategy. Revenge, I reminded myself, is an art that demands patience more than passion, accuracy more than vindictiveness. I began to build a dossier that was part critique, part indictment, each line constructed to be undeniable and merciless. I photographed pay stubs, recorded whispered apologies from frightened staff, traced the chain of suppliers back to a farm that had been paid in promises instead of money. I wrote emails to health inspectors and to anonymous complaint lines. Then I wrote more, because words in the right order can topple a kingdom. I reached out to a colleague I trusted, a journalist with a taste for scandal and the backbone to print the worst of truths. And together we choreographed a release that would land like a meteor at the industry's feet. But I could not let it be only exposure. Lucas had made me smaller. He had made me believe for a breath that I could be humiliated in public and still mean nothing. So every sentence I penned would be a restoration of self. I reread old messages, the ones where he wove honeyed plans into our future, and I let each lie be named plainly in my review. Hypocrisy, cruelty, vanity built on theft. I tempered the language with professional restraint. No melodrama, no indulgent spite. Because the world listens when the critic is cold and precise. While the dossier hardened, I fed the restaurant small public stumbles. Anonymous. Notes left on reservation platforms hinting at poor service. Carefully timed social posts from sympathetic ex-staffers that painted the staff as weary and overworked. A single food blogger's video that asked the right questions and filmed the wronged sous chef's hands trembling as she plated. I watched Lucas's empire wobble through the lenses I and others had placed upon it. His smile grew thin in photographs, his soirees felt less attended, and the woman who'd laughed the night she watched wine spill on me began to look over her shoulder. The city, that great gossiping beast, began to murmur. Yet I knew the final blow could not be mere rumor. It had to be official, irrefutable, the kind of sentence that comes with a stamp and a consequence. Michelin stars do not fall because a critic is in a mood. They fall because proof exists and witnesses corroborate it. I wrote my review as if I were carving a truth into a ledger that would not rot. I described the food with the care of someone who had once loved kitchens as sanctuaries. The shell of a dish flaking under the falsity of a sauce that masked staleness, the garnish that screamed of pretense rather than craft. And then I slipped in the things that could not be prettified. The way the maitre d' avoided staff, the hush that descended when certain names were mentioned, the tremor. In a line cook's hand when he was asked to work overtime without pay. I sent copies to the journalist, to the labor board, to a contact at Michelin who did not owe Lucas anything. I arranged for a respected inspector to make an unannounced visit, and I made sure our evidence arrived at the same hour the critic sat down with a notepad. All night I rehearsed the moment I would walk into the awards room where Lucas planned to flash triumph like a blade, the image of his smug face a canvas I would paint with his downfall. But I also wrestled with a quieter part of myself that lingered like an aftertaste, the knowledge that revenge can feed emptiness if it is not fed with purpose. I wanted him ruined, yes, but I also wanted the world to know why. I wanted the staff to be heard and paid and respected. I wanted this particular kitchen to stop chewing people up and calling it excellence. So when the inspector called me in, the morning, voice tired but steady, and said, "We need the full statement," I breathed and wrote until every detail felt true, every accusation backed by receipts or testimony. Submission felt like dropping a stone into a dark lake. You can predict the ripples, but not all the shapes they will make. The day the piece went live, I watched from an apartment window as the city blinked, and then the internet exploded in 1,000 tiny combustions of anger, sympathy, and disbelief. Lucas posted things that looked like damage control, pictures of cured hams and family-style dinners, a denial that read like a confession written badly. The woman who'd laughed in my face scrubbed her social profiles and posted a vague statement about privacy. The restaurant's reservations evaporated like breath on glass. And yet, amidst the satisfaction, something unexpected surfaced, a hollow that no headline would fill. I understood then that revenge changes you as much as it changes the target. My hands trembled not from victory, but from the recognition of how close I'd come to letting his cruelty set my rhythm. Still, the final curtain had not fallen. The industry has its own rituals. A list released, a night where accolades are clapped into existence. And there, under the chandeliers that had once witnessed my humiliation, Lucas would stand, waiting to see if the world validated him with a star. I secured a seat at that awards night table not as a critic anonymous anymore, but as a storyteller armed with public truth. The journalist would be there with a camera. The labor board had filed a case, and the inspector's report would be in hand. I wanted him to feel the air change around him, to taste the same helplessness he had poured over my skin. As the evening neared and I dressed in quiet armor rather than a dress meant to please, a different emotion crept in alongside the plan. Anticipation braided with a fear I had not expected. What if retribution did not unmake him, but instead lashed out at those I meant to protect? For a heartbeat I considered retreat, the old woman's instinct to fold and hide. Then I pictured the sous chef's hands, the exhausted smiles of cooks forced to sacrifice weekends, the way Lucas had tried to make me small with a gesture meant to erase a person. My decision re-solidified like cooled steel. I would see this through, not for spectacle, not for the thrill of revenge alone, but because justice demanded form and I had the pen. I stepped into the night toward a room full of flashes and applause, my chest tight and my nerve electric. And as the doors closed behind me, I felt the pull of everything that had led me here. Love turned knife, ambition tempered into resolve. And I knew that by the time the first name was called, something in both of us would be irrevocably different. The awards hall smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne, a place where applause is dispensed like currency and reputations are minted in seconds, and I felt the press of it against my ribs as if the room itself had breath. As lights flashed and champagne glasses chimed, Lucas moved through the crowd like a king in a borrowed crown, smiling the precise smile he'd practiced in selfies, unaware that his script had already been edited to a final draft he could not control. I sat with the journalist to my left, the inspector's report folded into her bag like a weapon, and across the room I watched him preen beneath the same chandeliers that had once seen wine pour over me. Only now the light hit him differently, crisp and revealing. The ceremony began with the predictable names and polite cheers, but beneath the formalities attention hummed, a current I had put into motion the moment I dried my notes, and decided that humiliation would not remain private. Then, when the presenter smiled and reached for the envelope that would name the evening's most anticipated star, a hush dropped, and my heart mounted like a held breath. Before the name was read, the journalist tapped my sleeve and slid her phone across the table. The headline was already live. Exclusive. Labor violations, supplier fraud, and intimidation at Lucas Aldrin's restaurant, inspectors' evidence attached. Cameras turned as if pulled by magnetism. People swiveled in their chairs, whispers rose like smoke, and Lucas's smile faltered just enough to make the room notice. He rose. He did not stumble toward the stage. He moved toward me, a predator reconciling the threat. "Amelia," he said, voice trimming with false composure. "What is this?" Around him, staff from other kitchens shifted, eyes darting to the journalist's screen, to the inspector's badge flashing like a warning. He tried to laugh, a hollow sound that scraped the varnish off the wooden panels. "Fake news," he spat, and his girlfriend, a pale, frightened thing now, murmured denial. But the evidence was surgical. Photographs of unpaid checks, audio of threats, receipts that mapped betrayal like a trail. The presenter, flustered, held the envelope like a judge about to deliver a verdict, and then, for the first time in my life, I felt the strange, intoxicating clarity of being seen for what I had always been. Not just a woman humiliated at a table, but a voice with the power to name truth. The journalist stood and spoke, her voice steady, reading selections from the inspector's findings while a cameraman filmed Lucas's face collapsing in real time. "We corroborated eyewitness testimony," she said. "We cross-checked ledgers, and we found consistent evidence of labor exploitation and supplier fraud." The crowd shifted from curiosity to outrage so quickly it felt like gravity changing direction. Someone in the front row gasped. A chef I admired covered his mouth. A table of investors exchanged looks that tasted like withdrawal. Lucas tried to shout denial, to turn the narrative into theater, but the inspector took the microphone and confirmed what I had submitted. Everything was documented and, more damningly for him, the complaint had come from someone within the restaurant, someone who had been silenced until now. The awards committee postponed the announcement. Murmurs rippling like a storm about to break, and phones lit up with the story, spreading through social channels until the hall that had housed gaiety now felt like the eye of a scandal. Lucas's hand found my shoulder then, a graceless, possessive motion that used to feel like belonging, and now felt like an accusation. I did not flinch. "You threw wine on me to show me my place," I said, my voice low but carrying, a confession to him and a statement to the room. "You made a spectacle to remind me I could be erased. Tonight, the spectacle is different." His face contorted between rage and the desperate calculus of damage control. He shouted my name, called me a liar, accused me of orchestrating a smear. But it was as if the words were shot into water. The witnesses had arrived, the labor board had its file, and the inspector's evidence was a net with no holes. Security, who had earlier smiled politely as celebrities passed, now closed ranks like conductors guiding an inevitable cadence. They asked him to step aside, to answer questions, and one of them read him his rights in a language he had only ever used to charm tables into reservations. The girlfriend, finally untethered from his shadow, left quickly, eyes hollow and shame-written, and cameras caught the moment as the sentence of his social death was delivered not by me, but by the cumulative truth of the people he had used. As he was led away, the room fractured into factions, those who clucked about the industry's cleanliness, those who cheered for accountability, and those who watched me with a different hunger altogether, as if my actions had been spectacle. I felt a strange storm behind my sternum, triumph braided with an ache that tasted like ash. It should have been pure victory, the kind that unstitched an old wound, but instead the wind landed with an emptiness that surprised me. Vengeance had unlatched a place inside me I hadn't known was held by him. In the aftermath, the journalist's footage stitched the night into an exposé that ran across morning shows and feeds, and the restaurant's reservations evaporated while the labor board moved with the cold, inexorable machinery of law. Praise for the courage of anonymous staff swelled, and they began to speak, small voices becoming an avalanche. Offers of legal help appeared like hands reaching across broken glass. Yet rewards arrived for me in ways I hadn't envisioned. Invitations to speak, requests for more pieces, and a swelling audience that wanted the voice they thought had been silenced. People messaged me with their own stories of being minimized, of being made small at tables while rich men ate applause, and I replied to a few, clumsy and human, offering what I could, which was not restitution but recognition. That night, walking home through streets glittering with the same indifferent lights as the hall, I realized revenge had been a lens. It sharpened what was crooked, but it did not heal what had been broken inside me by intimacy and betrayal. I had wanted him to feel powerless as I once had, and he would. But the prize I'd thought I craved, a neat, satisfying unmaking of him, was more complicated. Reprisal had opened a doorway to responsibility. What now for those who had been harmed, for me, and for the parts of the industry built on gloss and fear? As I watched news clips replay his departure and read messages from cooks who finally thought to breathe, I understood something tender and terrifying. That justice is not a single moment but a beginning of many small, relentless acts. My role had shifted from the woman who kept a secret to the one who sparked a conversation. The pain that had driven me was now a tool that could cut or build, and it would be up to me to choose which. The dust settled like ash, but the consequences kept falling. Subpoenas, settlements, testimonies that came like slow rains to wash clean the kitchen's stained floors. And as the weeks unfurled, I found myself dragged into rooms I had once only observed from a safe distance. Depositions under fluorescent lights, where I answered questions about dates and dialogues and receipts, meetings with lawyers who moved like chess players, and interviews where my words were sharpened and replayed until each syllable carried the weight of other people's futures. Every time I spoke, I felt both exposed and vital, like someone who'd been set on fire and then used that heat to forge a tool. Lucas fought back with the theatrics he knew best. Denials posted between carefully staged family photos, lawsuits meant to silence and intimidate. But his empire's cracks were already wide enough for truth to pour through, and the more he clawed, the more his supporters evaporated into the cold air of accountability. In court, he was smaller than he'd ever seemed in the polished photos, a man whose charm could not outpace the ledger of harm, whose apologetic eyes read as practiced rather than repentant. I watched him from the gallery, my heart a condensed, strange thing that felt less like triumph and more like a bell tolling the end of an era we had both been part of. The staff I'd first heard in whispers came forward one by one, faces lined with fatigue and bravery. They told stories I'd known and some I hadn't. A cook who had missed his daughter's recitals, a server whose rent was gambled away to cover unpaid wages, a pastry chef who had been promised partnership and then told to keep silent. We all grew into a strange and makeshift family in those sterile rooms, bound by the desire for something that felt rarer than revenge: fairness. As the settlement talks progressed, part of me delighted in the practical: funds for back pay, commitment to union talks, a manager removed and replaced with someone vetted and accountable. But another, quieter part asked what had been done for me. Had the wine and the humiliation been paid back? The answer arrived not in money or public apologies, but in a simpler, stranger currency, a shift in how I saw myself. I no longer flinched at a smirk. I no longer rearranged my step to accommodate someone else's ego. My sentences when I wrote were cleaner, my critiques sharper and kinder to those I sought to protect. I had become someone who could wield exposure not for spectacle but for repair. One afternoon, months after the awards night that had cracked Lucas's life like an egg, I received an envelope without return address. Inside, a photograph of the night, my dress dark with wine, his hand mid-gesture, and on the back, in a hand I recognized though I no longer felt its pull, 3 words: I am sorry. It was not a plea for me to take him back. It was the sort of thing people send to test whether a wound will open again. I folded the paper and put it in a drawer with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. There was no dramatic meeting, no climactic showdown at dawn. Revenge had not been a sword that returned to my hand polished and gleaming. It had been a tool that required constant tending, legislation, advocacy, the slow work of changing a culture that had rewarded charm over decency. And I had to decide whether I would spend the rest of my life sharpening it. The answer surprised me. Yes, but not for spite. I began mentoring young critics and line cooks, running workshops about wage law and dignity in the kitchen, and writing pieces that celebrated the small, radical acts of kindness that kept restaurants from becoming death traps for talent. People called me a crusader, a vindicator, and sometimes when I was alone, a woman who had let anger carry her farther than she'd intended. But the most persistent change was internal. Humiliation had once been an anchor that kept my voice shallow. Now it was a compass that directed its energy outward, toward repair. There were nights when the old ache returned, a headline that mentioned his name, a restaurant that had the same tilt toward theatrics over substance. And I felt the old desire to strike hard and theatrical again. Instead, I called the reporter, arranged meetings, opened channels for whistleblowers, and let the system of accountability be the visible blade rather than my personal vendetta. Lucas's name faded in time, as names do, but the ripples of what happened continued to shift tables and schedules and policies in ways that were quiet but real. In a small ceremony, not televised, no fans or flashing cameras, only hummed congratulations and the warm clink of cutlery. The kitchen that had been his received new leadership, fairer contracts, and a marked reduction in turnover. The sous chef whose hands had trembled when she plated instead learned to stand taller when customers praised a dish she'd once feared losing. She hugged me in the back alley after opening night, and the grip of that hug said, what words could not? Repair is possible. As for me, the audience that had swollen after the scandal remained, hungry for raw stories, and I fed them not with blood, but with narratives of restitution and resilience. I wrote, I spoke, I listened, and in those acts I found something I had thought revenge would give me: closure. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a courtroom confession broadcast in slow motion. It was paperwork, emails, a fund set up for unfairly treated staff, and the slow reclamation of a voice I had almost lost. Standing one evening on a small stage at a community center, I told a room full of young cooks the truth I'd learned. Anger can ignite change, but only when it's stewarded by compassion and anchored in purpose. Afterward, a woman came up to me with tears and said, "You made it safe for me to speak." Her words landed like a bell ringing in a quiet church, and I thought of the wine spilling across the table months ago and realized that my revenge had done something better than destroy. It had opened a space where the small, honest lives of workers could be honored, where apologies might mean repair instead of performative regret, and where a critic's pen could be used to build rather than merely indict. The memory of Lucas's smirk would never completely leave me, but neither would the knowledge that I had transformed a wound into a work that mended more than one life, and that at last felt like justice served.